We saw in the last PowerPoint that cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. Let's start talking about what kinds of things regulate stroke volume and regulate heart rate. So just a reminder here, EDV is the end diastolic volume. That's when the heart is full of blood. That's as full as it ever gets. Then it pumps out a little bit, the stroke volume, and then whatever is left we call the end systolic volume. Very simple. There are three main factors that affect stroke volume. They're called preload, contractility, also known as inotropy, and afterload. And we're going to talk about the factors that affect these in turn. Notice all those little illustrations there showing all this kind of stuff. They're trying to make clear the relationships between end diastolic volume, end systolic volume, stroke volume, and so on. Take a minute or two and look those over. Remember that end diastolic volume minus stroke volume equals end systolic volume. If you take the heart when it's full, subtract the amount that it pumped out, then you get how much is left. So EDV, that's when the heart is full. ESV, after the heart pumps some out. I'm going to ask you about this. And don't just memorize the equation. Notice that EDV, for example, would be equal to ESV plus SV. The amount that's left in the heart plus the amount you pumped out would be equal to the amount when the heart was full. So understand it, don't just memorize it. So what regulates stroke volume? First is called preload. It's the degree of stretch of cardiac muscle cells before they contract. This is known as the Frank-Starling law, by the way. What it says is that the more blood that's in the heart, the more you're going to pump out. And that's in part because the blood in the heart causes the ventricle to expand a little bit, and then due to elasticity, it snaps back. So the more that's in there, the more you pumped out. So it's called a length-tension relationship. That's just a fancy way of saying that the greater the EDV, the greater the SV. The more blood in the heart when it's full, the more it's going to pump out. It really makes sense when you think about it. The more you've got in there to pump out, the more you're going to pump out when you contract. It's really just very straightforward. More blood coming into the ventricle means more blood will be pumped out. That's what preload means, okay? Slow heartbeat and exercise increase venous return. So people that have a slow heartbeat, that means that there's a longer delay between beats. That means more blood comes back to the heart between beats, therefore preload will be larger. Lance Armstrong has a resting heart rate of 35 beats per minute. At least he did when he was winning the Tour de France competitions. That's because his heart is so strong that it doesn't need to beat that often. And what that means is then every time his heart does beat, it pumps more blood than most people's heart would beat, or than his heart would beat if it were beating faster. Exercise likewise. When you exercise, you're causing more blood to come back to the heart within a given amount of time, and that means you're going to pump more out again. That's preload, okay? Increased venous return distends, stretches the ventricles, and increases the contraction force. You see the graphs there showing you. That's the classic relationship here. The more blood that's in there, the more you pump out, up to a level. I mean, when you get out 400, that's, we're tapering off at that point. But up to that point, the more blood, see, look on the bottom graph there, end ventricular end diastolic volume, the greater it is, the greater the stroke volume, okay? Very straightforward. Contractility. Contractility is the contractile strength at a given muscle length, independent of muscle stretch and EDV. That's the technical definition. What it really comes down to is contractility is how forcefully the heart beats. I've used this example before. Think of a sponge that's got water in it. Imagine you lightly squeeze the sponge. A little bit of water will come out. Now imagine you really squeeze the sponge hard. More water is going to come out, isn't it? So therefore, the more forcefully your heart contracts, the more blood it's going to squeeze out. Therefore, if you increase contractility, you will increase stroke volume. And we already know, for example, that the sympathetic nervous system increases contractility. We know that beta-1 receptors increase contractility. Epinephrine will increase contractility because it binds to beta-1 receptors. So contractility, increasing contractility, increases stroke volume. Then there are what we call positive inotropic agents. Inotropic refers to force. So these are positively forceful things, okay? So more calcium, all right? Remember when we looked at the actual myocardial action potential, sodium was the rising phase, and then calcium was the prolongation phase. Remember that graph stretched out in the middle? So the greater the calcium, the longer the calcium channels are going to stay open, therefore the more blood the heart pumps out. So increasing calcium increases stroke volume. Hormones like thyroxine, that's thyroid hormone, glucagon, as we'll see when we study the digestive system, glucagon is the antagonistic hormone to insulin. Glucagon raises blood sugar. And epinephrine. All three of those hormones increase contractility, all right? They all increase the forcefulness of contraction. Digoxin, digitalis, a cardiac glycoside from the foxglove plant. This is one of the main drugs used for people that have hearts that are not pumping enough blood. Digoxin will increase the forcefulness of the heartbeat, therefore the heart pumps more blood. Then there are negative inotropic agents. These decrease contractility. Acidosis will do that. Increased extracellular potassium. Remember, potassium causes the descending phase of the action potential. So greater potassium means you will hyperpolarize more, and therefore the heart won't be able to pump as much. Calcium channel blockers. So there are lots of drugs, like the one there in the illustration. There are calcium channel blockers. They're often used for people with high blood pressure. So they will decrease contractility. And as we see, if you decrease contractility, you automatically decrease blood pressure. And beta-1 blockers. We already saw that beta-1 receptors increase contractility. So if you block beta-1, that will decrease contractility, which then in turn decreases blood pressure. I want you to know positive and negative inotropic agents because many drugs are based on this concept of increasing or decreasing the forcefulness of the contraction of the heart. And that will directly affect stroke volume. It will either increase or decrease the amount of blood pumped out. Then afterload. Afterload is the pressure that must be overcome for ventricles to eject blood. So think about in the aorta. Remember how the aorta, we have the ascending aorta, it makes that arch. Well, so when the left ventricle contracts, it pumps blood up through the semilunar valve. Some of that blood will go over the hump and make it out to the body, but some of that blood will fall back again, right? And that's what closes the semilunar valve. Well, think about it. The next time the ventricle pumps, it doesn't just have to open the valve, it has to move all the blood sitting on top of the valve. That blood is afterload. See, that blood adds pressure that has to be overcome in order to pump blood out of the heart. So in general, the biggest factor that we're going to be concerned with is hypertension, high blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, it puts pressure on those valves, keeping them closed, which makes it harder to pump blood out. That's why hypertension is just so disastrous in so many ways. Here, hypertension, as we see, is going to reduce the amount of blood your heart is pumping, and that's not good. All right, let's turn to heart rate. Remember, cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. We saw factors that affected stroke volume. Now let's look at factors that affect heart rate. We talk about positive chronotropic factors. So trope basically means to grow, to change, has a lot of meanings. Chrono means time. Chronos, the Greek god of time. Chronotropic means they change time. In other words, they change the rate. So chronotropic agents, factors, change heart rate. What will do that? Well, the sympathetic nervous system. It will activate beta-1 receptors, and as we already saw before, beta-1 receptors increase heart rate. What they do is they basically work on the sinus rhythm of the heart. They work on the sinoatrial node, causing it to have a shorter lapse in between when the sodium depolarization happens. Stimulants like caffeine and nicotine, it's automatic. If you drink coffee or anything else with caffeine, Coke, whatever, Mountain Dew, I remember, what was it? It was one of the orange drinks. Sun-Kissed Orange was incredibly high in caffeine. Nicotine, if you smoke a cigarette, it'll make your heart rate go up. It's unavoidable. Can you see why, if you got high blood pressure, doctors will tell you, or if you got heart problems of any kind, doctors will tell you, lay off the coffee and lay off the cigarettes. Both of those increase your heart rate, which, if you've already got a bad heart, could put stress on your heart. Hormones, electrolyte imbalances, stress, acidosis, and many other factors can affect heart rate. Not gonna go through all of them. Make sure I did a little whiteboard video on this stuff. Make sure to watch my whiteboard video. I do outline a few more because I have a little bit more room on the whiteboard to do it. Then negative chronotropic factors. These decrease heart rate. So beta blockers and calcium channel blockers. Notice those also affected stroke volume. They decrease stroke volume. They also decrease heart rate. They're prescribed often for hypertension. They lower blood pressure. Cold temperatures, electrolyte imbalances, and other factors can also negatively affect the heart rate. It'll lower it. Cold temperatures are interesting. There's something called the diving reflex. Really interesting. When you splash water in your face, it causes a sequence of events to take place. Your heart slows down, your peripheral blood vessels vasoconstrict, and you shunt blood away from your internal organs out to your skeletal muscles. You also contract your spleen, and what that does is the spleen serves as a reservoir for blood, so it makes more oxygenated blood available to your tissues. This happens like in the Weddell seal. Weddell seals can dive for like over an hour at a time or something, and they do that with the diving reflex. When they jump into the water face first, that initiates the diving reflex. You can do that too. If you ever have to jump into some water that's cold, splash some water in your face before you jump in. That will slow your heart down. It'll do peripheral vasoconstriction, which will take blood away from the surface of your body, and then the water won't feel quite as cold when you jump in. I've tried it. It works. I mean, not dramatically, but it definitely works. Okay, the autonomic nervous system can also regulate all of these things. So the sympathetic nervous system is activated by emotional or physical stressors. It can be a real crisis or an imagined crisis. You know, having to give a speech in front of the class can activate your sympathetic nervous system. You're not really in any danger, but emotionally you feel like you're in danger. Norepinephrine causes the pacemaker to fire more rapidly, increasing heart rate, and at the same time increases contractility. Parasympathetic does the opposite. Acetylcholine hyperpolarizes pacemaker cells by opening potassium channels, and that lowers heart rate. Heart at rest exhibits what we call vagal tone, and that's, remember, the SA node wants to fire 100 beats per minute. The vagus nerve slows it down to 75. That's the vagal tone. SA node creates 100 impulses per minute. Vagus slows it to around 75. These are just estimates. You know, it differs from one person to another. Like I said, my heart rate is around 55. When I was running cross country in high school, my heart rate was around 45. Remember, Lance Armstrong's heart rate, when he was at the height of his physical ability, was down around 35. So chemical regulation of the heart, hormones. Epinephrine from the adrenal medulla increases heart rate and contractility because it works on beta-1 receptors. Thyroxine, which is thyroid hormone, increases heart rate and enhances the effects of norepinephrine and epinephrine. When we talk about the endocrine system, we're going to talk a lot about thyroxine. Thyroxine is a very powerful hormone in the body. It has a lot of effects. People who have hypothyroidism are sluggish and cold and all kinds of stuff like that. So thyroxine is really a very important hormone, and it directly affects the heart. Then intra- and extracellular ion concentrations like calcium and potassium. Again, high levels of calcium increase heart rate contractility. High levels of calcium and then high levels of potassium will hyperpolarize the membrane. Those will decrease those things, all right? So what's the point here? The point here is that cardiac output is affected by stroke volume and heart rate, and in turn, stroke volume and heart rate are affected by a lot of things. So medical practitioners have to be kind of on the alert for things that may affect heart rate and stroke volume, because those will affect somebody's cardiac output, how much blood they're getting to their tissues. So homeostatic imbalances here. Tachycardia means an abnormally fast heart rate. That's normally over 100 beats per minute. That's considered tachycardia. Now that's normal if you're exercising, but if not, it might not be a good sign. If persistent, it can lead to fibrillation, and remember, that can be very dangerous. Then the heart doesn't end up pumping any blood at all. Bradycardia, an abnormally slow rate, below 60 beats per minute. Now, as I said, my heart rate's 55, so it may result in grossly inadequate blood circulation, but it can also be a desirable result of endurance training. So good athletes who are in really good shape often have low heart rates. There you see a tachometer they have in cars, measures the RPM. There's Marsha Brady from whatever that sitcom was on TV, the Brady Bunch. And there's Tom Brady, very slow. All right, bradycardia, slow. Tom Brady, very slow. All right, and there you go. Just a couple illustrations there to show you. There's tachycardia, there's bradycardia, there's fibrillation. Fibrillation, that's not a good sign.